their studies. My lords, I wish I could share the optimism expressed by so many of my noble friends about the condition of our economy as we come out of the lockdown. But I fear that when things reopen, they will not go back to normal. The malign psychological changes wrought by the epidemic and its associated closures will last long after the immediate threat of the virus has passed. The world into which we emerge from lockdowns will be poorer, colder, more pinched, more authoritarian. As we haul ourselves from the pupa, the chrysalis of these closures, we will be transformed, and the evidence is not in a good way. I'm not really talking about the economics. I've nothing to add to what Baroness Noakes said. She quoted the figures on our debt, on our deficit level, the hit we've taken, a hit last year that was worse than in any equivalent period during either of the two world wars or the Great Depression. But eventually, after many years or decades, we will be able to make good that damage. What alarms me more is a phenomenon well attested to by behavioral psychologists, the way in which a collective threat or a perceived collective threat throws people back on, if you like, their Paleolithic heuristics. It makes us warier, more suspicious, more illiberal, more hierarchical, more demanding of the smack of firm government. My noble friend Lord Vesey drew a parallel with 1945 and the Beveridge Report. And in general, I think that parallels with the Second World War should be used sparingly in politics. But on this occasion, it seems to me a quite valid linkage to make, because that was the last time that I think we felt the experience of a collective threat of similar magnitude. And the result was that once the emergency had passed, the demand for collectivist measures, which had been brought about by the changes in our economy and our psychology during the Blitz, during the mobilization, endured. So long after their notional justification was no longer there, we still had identity cards until 1952, we still had food rationing until 1954, we still had full male conscription until 1960, and indeed when it comes to some of the economic controls put in place in the first half of the 1940s, in many cases they lasted until the Thatcher reforms in the 1980s. Indeed, some aspects of education and healthcare are still there, products essentially of wartime thinking and of full mobilization. What alarms me is that a similar change in public psychology, and therefore in, if you like, electoral calculations, will endure long after the passing of this disease, and that governments will cling on to powers that were taken on a supposedly contingent basis, but be reluctant to return them when the emergency passes. After 1945, there was a demand for big spending and big government. People were not in the mood to listen to the argument that we were bankrupt, that our treasury was empty, our credit exhausted, that we'd actually spent all of our resources in the cause of defeating Hitler. People felt that they'd earned something more. And so we went about an extraordinary expansion of the remit of the state. And I can see similar arguments creeping in now. When's the last time that, my lords, that you heard anyone, either in this chamber or in another one, making a case that we should cut? Pick pretty much any of them, the grants to businesses, to charities, to the uplifts in public sector pay or in benefits. It becomes almost impossible and pointless to make that argument when the mood is as it is. And so debates in both chambers come to resemble a kind of prolonged episode of the Today programme, a series of demands for additional spending, each individually defensible, but collectively unaffordable. I was very pleased to hear my noble friend the Minister saying that the government intends to move back to a balanced budget when circumstances allow. But I'm very alarmed equally by the widespread view that this is going to have to be through tax cuts, through tax rises. When you try and balance the budget with tax rises, you find that you are reducing the revenue-generating bit of the economy in order to sustain a rise of the revenue-consuming bit of the economy. And of course, that is no way of getting rid of a structural debt. The way of getting rid of the debt is for the economy to grow. How do you get the economy to grow? Well, there's no magic formula here. We've seen it happen every time it's been applied. You get an economy to grow by applying the principles of secure property, an independent judiciary, competitive regulations, free trade, open markets, and lower, flatter, and simpler taxes. Very pleased to hear what Lord Carrington had to say about the simplification as well as the lowering and, in some cases, the abolition of taxes, particularly on employment. If our priority is to get the economy moving again, then far from raising taxes on investment and employment, we should be looking to reduce or to at least suspend those taxes so that we get companies hiring again. But of course, my lords, these are difficult enough arguments to make in normal times, even before we had the changes to our outlook wrought by the prolonged lockdown, even before we were thrown back on these Paleolithic instincts of wanting to keep things close and to become more protectionist and more introverted. If we couldn't win these arguments 2 years ago, is there any chance coming out of it that the country will have an appetite for significant deregulation or tax cuts? As the poet says, forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear.